hey, didn't see you there. So I'm like here to like tell you about the American dream and how like you're supposed to like do what other people want you to do and like make money and like, oh my god, that's such a good tweet. Oh my god, you're so annoying.
If you really want to know about the American dream, watch my project I made for Amstud.
The idea of freedom is an integral part of the American identity, and although everyone has an individual dream, the true American dream is the idea of a land where people are given equal opportunity and the freedom to chase their dream. However, oftentimes, individuals find themselves stripped of their freedom and placed under restrictions by society that deny them of their dream. When living under the burden of society's expectations, one can never gain true freedom. Therefore, in order to truly achieve freedom, the American dream, one must defy the expectations of society and stop trying to gain acceptance by it.
In the play Death of a Salesman, the author Arthur Miller shows a perfect example of how the American dream can't be achieved by a person living life based on society's standards. The main character, Willie Loman, strives to meet societal standards and wants to be liked by others, make money, and leave behind a legacy. He dreams of making a mark on the world, which he believes can only be done by dying the death of a salesman. While fighting to achieve this convoluted dream of his, Willie must adjust himself to the likings of society. Later, when Willie finally meets life's end and his family attends his funeral, Biff points out the flaws in his father's dreams when he says, "You know something? There's more of him in that front stoop than in all the sales he ever made. He had all the wrong dreams. All wrong." Biff points out that if Willie spent as much time focusing on things that mattered, like his family, as he did on being remembered by society, Willie would have been happier. However, because he never shed himself of society's pressures, he died without achieving his dream.
During the Progressive Era in America, the suffrage movement began to form. Rather than remain restricted under society's idea of a woman as docile, feminine, submissive, and weak, suffragists defied society's expectation for women and campaigned for their right to vote and to be seen as members of society. At the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, suffragists declared that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By declaring that women are equal to men, suffragists defied the restrictions of society and in doing so achieved freedom. Similarly, in Edith Wharton's novel The Awakening, Wharton depicts the struggles of an oppressed woman against the expectations of society. Edna Pontellier never experiences true fulfillment as a wife and mother because she isn't able to live for herself or do what makes her happy. However, throughout the book, she begins to live for herself and finally reaches a sense of freedom. Wharton writes, "Every step she took toward relieving herself of obligations added to her strength and expansion as an individual. She began to look with her own eyes, to see and to apprehend the deeper undercurrents of life. No longer was she content to feed upon opinion when her own soul had invited her." Through defying the expectations of others, Edna gains her freedom, which she was denied when she lived with the burden of society's expectations.
In the 1920s, flapper culture was introduced. Women began wearing shorter skirts and makeup and introduced the idea of female sexuality. Rather than remain restricted by a society that refused to acknowledge female sexuality or individualism, flappers defied society and gained a newfound sense of freedom. According to 1920s movie star Colleen Moore, long skirts, corsets, and flowing tresses have gone. The American girl will see to this. She is independent, a thinker who will not follow slavishly the ordinances of those who have in the past decreed this or that for her to wear. Zelda Fitzgerald also echoed these sentiments and said, "I like the jazz generation, and I hope my daughter's generation will be jazzier. I want my girl to do as she pleases and be what she pleases regardless." In the 1920s, women like Colleen Moore and Zelda Fitzgerald defied society's image of the American woman as prudent and abstinent. Instead, they achieved a new sense of female expression and independence and gained freedom, showing that in order to gain freedom, one must defy the oppression of society. In the same era, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby shows the fate that can befall someone who lives too long with the burden of society's pressure and seeks society's approval. Jay Gatsby, a newly rich member of West Egg, feels like an outsider from the old money society of East Egg and strives to be accepted into it. Gatsby spends his entire life trying to impress Daisy and meet her standards. However, because Gatsby spends his entire life trying to live up to society's expectations, he dies alone and without achieving his dream. According to Nick, before his death, Gatsby himself didn't believe Daisy would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old worm world and paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. Gatsby died unable to achieve his dream because he never deviated from society's expectations and lost his freedom because of this. During the Civil Rights era, African Americans who suffered under societal oppression began to dream of freedom. Rather than continue living under this oppression, they defied society's expectations in order to gain liberation. For instance, during the Birmingham campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, protesters were met with harsh criticism and asked to stop protesting because it was untimely. In response, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his Letter from a Birmingham Jail, explaining that their actions were just and necessary in order to achieve freedom. It reads, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ears of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see that justice too long delayed is justice denied." King then goes on to justify breaking laws because those laws were unjust. By defying the laws and expectations of the town of Birmingham and encouraging others to do the same, Martin Luther King was able to defy society, and he and his protesters gained liberation from societal pressure.
In Lorraine Hansberry's play, A Raisin in the Sun, Walter Lee Younger, a black man living in the post-civil rights movement America, is incredibly unsatisfied with his life. He feels that his family does not have a large enough house or enough money to thrive in the world. He struggles through several failed business ventures funded by money left from his late father. Finally, his mother decides that the remainder of the money will go to buying a home for the family. The home that Mama chooses happens to be right in the middle of an entirely white neighborhood, causing some friction with the white neighbors. A man from that block approaches the Youngers and offers them a monetary bribe in an attempt to get the family to steer clear of their neighborhood. But in a moment of clarity and rebellion against the white societal oppressors, Walter stands up for his family, stating that, "We are very proud people, and we have decided to move into our house because my father, he earned it for us brick by brick." Walter was able to find true strength through a defiance of the majority.
During the 1960s and 70s, an anti-war movement spread throughout America. It began primarily on college campuses as students and others who didn't support the war in Vietnam staged protests and parades against the war. However, this movement was a minority group and faced a lot of criticism from society. The majority was against the anti-war movement, and sometimes violence even broke out. However, in expressing opposition to the Vietnam War, protesters defied society, were able to exercise their freedom of speech because of it, showing that by going against society, a minority is able to gain freedom, the American dream. In Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, from the chapter On the Rainy River, O'Brien recounts a time from his youth when he was drafted into the Vietnam War. Tim didn't support the war, but feels pressure from his friends, family, and society to do his duty for his country. When faced with the decision of whether or not to go to war, Tim ultimately submits to society and says, "And right then I submitted. I would go to the war, I would kill and maybe die, because I was embarrassed not to." However, Tim recognizes that this was the cowardly choice and that going to war was not a happy ending. By giving up his freedom to choose whether or not to support the war in Vietnam, Tim showed by submitting to society individuals are stripped of their freedom.
Mark Twain's novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck's moral journey is a perfect example of the freedom that an individual can gain through the defiance of society. Throughout the book, Huck finds himself questioning the racist views that society has taught him and makes decisions based on morality and not societal pressure. Ultimately, when faced with the decision of whether or not to return Jim to slavery, Huck decides to do the moral thing and rips up the letter he's written to Jim's old master. Huck says, "And then I says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell." Huck's two decisions to defy society resulted in Jim's freedom and finally his own, showing that the defiance of society's wishes results in the freedom of the individual.
Every American possesses each one of those qualities, but there is one thing that truly separates those who achieve their American dream and those who don't. A person needs to, against all odds, no matter what is standing in their way, have the ability to stand up against their oppressors and break free from the societal restrictions that are holding them back. The American dream is achievable for those who are willing to go against the majority and mark their own path towards life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
See? Oh, so that's what the American dream is about. Can you, like, write my essay?
No.